Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
My name is Hart Schäfer. I'm the Vice President for the World Bank for South Asia. And I invite you to join me on this journey about the Himalayas, the glaciers, the melting glaciers of the Himalayas. All of you probably have traveled to South Asia. And when you travel to South Asia from Europe, you cross the Himalayas. And if you are lucky enough to have a window seat and you are awake, and you look outside, then you see these marvelous mountains and you see these glaciers. But what we don't see at 30,000 feet is that these glaciers are melting, that these glaciers are receding. And that is what today's session is about. We need to really make sure that we stop the melting glaciers in the Himalayas, because that impact could be detrimental for the people, for the environment, for the economy. 750 million people in the Ganga, Brahmaputra, and Indus Basin could be affected by putting in jeopardy the water resources for agricultural production, and then put in jeopardy food production, could be affected in the way that energy is put in jeopardy, energy production. So this is something that goes right to the core of the World Bank's mission of improving livelihoods of the people that we serve. And if we continue to not do anything about global or regional climate change, if we don't do anything about black carbon, then this glacier melting will continue. And I think this is what we are about to hear today. We have a number of experts here who will first tell us why the glaciers are melting. And then we'll open a space for discussion. What does this mean for our policies? What does it mean for our projects? What does it mean for our behavioral change in terms of arresting these melting glaciers? Because it could have a huge impact on the people, on the economy, and the environment. I invite you to join us today and to engage in the discussion after we hear from our panelists. And now, let me hand over to Manisha Natarajan, who is our moderator and an expert in the area of Himalayas, glaciers, and the Himalayas itself. Manisha, thank you.
I think I'm mic'd up. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm Manisha Natarajan. I work in New Delhi with CNBC India. I do a weekly show called Urban Reality, which focuses on different issues of sustainability, some of the challenges that my country and my cities are facing, starting from air pollution to waste management to climate change. I was very excited when I was invited by the World Bank to moderate this very special panel discussion on melting Himalayan glaciers. We call it Himalayas. I think most of you call it the Himalayas. Doesn't matter. These are mountains which are very close to our hearts. They're sacred to us. We take our children every winters for holidays to the mountains. Anything that disturbs them is going to disturb that ecology and, of course, a lot of societies and communities which are living in the mountain area. We can already see the effects. It's getting warmer. It's getting harder to take our families there for holidays and vacations. It's real and present. In the district of Uttarakhand, which is right at the lower Himalayas, 30 traditional crops have stopped getting cultivated because of the climate change. So today's conversation is really important because, for all of us, we thought the conversations are centering more and more around the Arctics and the Antarctics. I mean, they're important too, but so are the Himalayas, and specifically so because starting from Afghanistan right to Myanmar, we are home to some of the poorest communities of the world, and they bear the brunt, the maximum of any climate change. Seeing is believing, so we're going to start this morning with a very special data visualization presentation. This is by National Geographic. Their teams are in the region. They've visited several glaciers. In fact, they have put together a fantastic see it to believe it sort of presentation to tell you what's really happening and what could or what is the worst to come ahead of us. I'm going to invite on stage Dr. Stephen Brunby. He's a Senior Director for Geographic Visualization at the National Geographic Society. Dr. Stephen Brunby, may we have you here to run us through the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, everybody. And a few specific thank yous. It's always great to be at the World Bank, and specific thank yous to Tribhuvan University, Isimad, the government of Nepal, Future Water, and distinguished members from the Nepal Embassy in attendance, Deputy Chief of Mission Jiban Prakesh Shrestha and Manish Jungtapa. Next, please. So thank you very much for the intro. National Geographic is very much focused on understanding and showing the world what's going on in the third pole, the very large amount of water that's trapped in snow and ice in the Himalayas, in an area where there's 240 million people living in the hills and mountains, and then another 1.6 or so billion people downstream. As already mentioned, it covers 8 countries. It feeds many major river systems, and if society continues on its current path with production of greenhouse gases and other climate change phenomena, 2/3 of the remaining glaciers are expected to be gone by 2100, with lots of implications. So next, please. Okay, so the Himalayas, and of course you can see it's the part of that very large region to the north of India and west of China, is just one of a number of water towers. So while we're particularly focused on the Himalayas here today, this is a global phenomenon of climate change starting to impact what we think of as the water towers, the freshwater sources for so many of the world's population. Okay? And not just because we're National Geographic, not just the world's population, the human population, but also all the animal and plant communities that live downstream from these mountains and have evolved to be there and also face massive disruption. Okay, and we're working with, in particular in the case of the Himalayas, we're working with local researchers at the University of Tribhuvan to really bring out the best possible science to explain what's going on there. Next, please. So when we talk about the Himalayas, of course, a lot of folks are used to thinking about Sagarmatha or Jomolungma, or as we call it in the West, Mount Everest. And this mountain, of course, gets much of the attention in the area, but it's just one exemplar of mountains less well known over a huge area. It's got 3 major glaciers associated with it, but there's 54,000 glaciers throughout the Hindu Kush Himalaya. This is actually put together with the world's best available commercial space data, and with the currently world state-of-the-art processing to turn it into the world's first very high-resolution commercial space data-based 3D model, all collected from space. So while we can send folks to study, to explore on the ground, a lot of the exploration now actually happens from orbit. And that's one of the ways that we can scale these techniques to study all the world's water tower systems. Right? Okay, next, please. So here's the sort of key result. As we're all aware, there's been substantial change in the glaciers over the last several decades. What we're looking at here, so dark blue is the current spatial extent of the glaciers in the vicinity of Mount Everest. The light blue represents the spatial extent as directly observed in 1962. So in 1962, the very first satellites were able to start collecting imagery of the mountains. That data was US government military data that's now been declassified and is now available to science. And we were able to process that and compare it to the latest satellite observations and produce this difference. This was made by Dr. Tobias Balch at the University of St. Andrews and his team. So you can see there's substantial change. But we also know that it's not just about the change in the outline of the glaciers. It's also about how much of the glaciers thinned, which is a very, very important point. And it can be deceptive. Even when you fly over and it all looks fine, without sophisticated techniques, you can't tell how much the glaciers are actually changing their thickness. So the glaciers, of course, they're a natural reservoir. They store the water that's rained on the mountains, and the mountains attract more than their fair share of rain because of interesting physics. This is the sort of demand. This is the supply side. How much water is sort of stored in these reservoirs up there, and stored in solid phase. But if we go to the next slide, please. Okay, yeah, let's just hit this. You can see we've got. We can measure how much glacier is up there and how much permanent snowpack, which is also being affected. Next, please. But we can also, from space, start to see where the demand is, both in the mountain region itself and also downstream. So again, by combining analysis of satellite imagery, and not just single images, but large amounts of satellite imagery, combined with models of human consumption, the yellow regions on this visualization are showing agricultural zones which have a certain amount of water demand, and then the red splotches are human settlements, major human settlements, because there's little tiny human settlements spread all through this region. And you can see there's a large area that's dependent on downstream precipitation, but also take direct input from the mountain system. Next, good. And what we're doing at National Geographic Society is helping scientists bring together the best available science to explain exactly what's going on, to point out stuff that might not be quite obvious, like the fact that in the Ganges river system, the human demand down that river is actually about the same order of magnitude as the amount of water that's needed just to keep the river healthy. Okay? So when you have any sort of climate fluctuation, just the monsoons are late, or there's some sort of small fluctuation in the river, you start to face terrible trade-offs between, do you keep the river happy, or do you meet the demands of all the populations downriver? We can also see that the majority of the water you demand down the river is agricultural rather than settlements. So a lot of the questions about, or the thought about answers to, like, how do communities become more resilient to climate change down the river are going to depend upon agricultural solutions, right? And if you are planning to increase industry and increase settlements and increase agriculture, there are going to have to be trade-offs that are going to have to happen all the way up and down river systems that cross multiple country boundaries. So it's not enough to think about things in isolation. The community has to come together and make joint solutions. Next, please. And I think that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Brunby. So our next speaker is a very interesting person. He's a scientist, lead scientist for National Geographic. He's led 55 expeditions across different glaciers and mountain regions, including the Mount Everest. He's right now in Nepal. And we've pre-recorded this interview. We will, of course, be interviewing him a little bit later, getting a voice interview included. But hear him out on what his real experiences are, because he's feeling that change, he's seeing that change, and he's going to tell us what's going on with the Himalayan glaciers. Paul, yes, did I introduce the name, or I forgot that? All right, let's bring on Mr. Paul Majewski.
My name is Paul Majewski. I'm the director of the Climate Change Institute at the University of Maine, and I'm sitting on a stone wall in Fortsy in Nepal, and more specifically in the Himalayas, very, very close to Amadablam and Mount Everest, spectacular mountains that everybody knows about. These mountains are part of the Himalayas, and the Himalayas have tens of thousands of glaciers, and those glaciers are critically important to 20% of the world's population. Whether or not those glaciers get bigger or smaller is extremely important to agriculture, ecosystem and human health, the potential for flooding, a variety of other things. A fantastic report just came out by ICIMOD. It's a non-governmental organization in Nepal, and they've summarized in a fantastic way all of the information about this particular region, the Khumbu Himalaya. And they talk about how the fact that the glaciers have gotten smaller over the last 10 to 20 years. They talk about many of the implications of this decrease in the size of the glaciers. But one of the things that's particularly important is this part of a natural cycle or not. And in Greenland, about 20 years ago, we collected a record using an ice core, a cylinder that goes back in time, that goes back year by year, 110,000 years. And we were able, with that record, to see natural cycles in the climate, and what is happening today is absolutely not part of a natural cycle. We are seeing an increase in warming that is much faster. We're seeing a change in the chemistry of the atmosphere that is unparalleled in 100,000, and I can say easily even a million years, if not Earth history. All of these dramatic and fast changes are critically important to places like the Himalayas, because the Himalayas are an important water tower for, as I mentioned earlier, 20% of the world's population. When you think about that, 20% of the world's population totally dependent on the amount of water that comes into this region. If there's too much water, because the glaciers are melting too fast, there's an immense amount of flooding. If there is too little water, then agriculture begins to fail. And over time, we will most likely, unfortunately, see melting accelerating, which means more flooding, unless we have some mitigation tools to deal with this. And we will, as a consequence of, in time, having less and less glacier volume, therefore less and less water availability, we'll see these regions having potentially more trouble with agriculture, and we'll also see these regions having a harder time utilizing hydropower and hydroelectric power. And hydroelectric power, as I've learned on the way up here, we're at about 3,800 meters, serves about 90% of the total energy for the people in this region, with 10% being the other, in solar being the other part. So this is a very important place to study. ISIMOD has done a fantastic job organizing all of this information, and there's a lot more that we need to do to understand how fast this change can be in the future and what the impacts of this change are going to be.
All right, that was Paul Majewski with real data and saying that he can feel unprecedented change. In fact, he mentioned water, either too much or too little, and that's going to affect the mountain communities the first. Our next speaker is a very special guest from Pakistan, Ms. Aisha Khan. She's the Executive Director of Civil Society Coalition for Climate Change and also the CEO of Mountain and Glacier Organization. Aisha has worked with the mountain communities in Pakistan who are struggling today for their livelihood with the climate change palpable and immediate in their lives, not a distant phenomena. Aisha Khan, may we have you here?
Thank you, Manisha. Very happy to be here and get this opportunity to share my experiences of how I see the Himalayan glaciers and their melting affecting the mountain communities. Mountain ecosystems are known for their fragility and for the vital role that they play in the global climate planetary regime, as well as for their contribution to the provisioning and the regulating and the cultural services. Mountain communities are about just as fragile and vulnerable as the mountain environment itself. Mountain topography is generally very rugged. Land holdings are usually not very large, and crop cultivation is done on small terraced fields. Due to the high altitude and the short summer season, only single cropping is possible. And there are not many opportunities for alternative income diversifications. Therefore, the centrality and the critical importance of water in mountain communities is very, very important. Disruption in water flows has an impact on agriculture. As we heard Paul say earlier, if there's too little water at the time of the planting season, there is crop failures and there is food scarcity. If there's too much water at the end of the season when the crops are ready to be harvested, again, you have a disaster waiting to happen and it affects their food security. But agriculture is not the only thing that gets affected by the disrupted water flows. The global warming is also contaminating the sources from where mountain communities collect their water for drinking purposes and for their domestic use. This has a direct impact on their health. Disease is on the rise, and this affects their productivity. And not only that, it also makes them spend the meager savings that they have on medical expenses. there's a new phenomena as a result of the unpredictability and the erratic water flows. And this trend is the outmigration of the male members of the population. They have to leave their homes in search of livelihoods outside their villages. And this creates a new set of vulnerabilities for those who are left behind, especially the women, the children, and the elderly. This is village Katishu. It's one example of many other villages that are in the Karakoram mountain range. This village is located at an altitude of 10,000 feet. Many years ago, this village could produce enough food to take care of the food requirements of all its inhabitants. But today it's facing food scarcity issues. The changing climate is also shifting the development priorities of the mountain communities. 20 years ago, when I first went into this region to work there, the first development requirement was education, then health, and then water-related infrastructure. Today, when I go there, the order has reversed. The first need is water-related infrastructure, the second is health, and the third is education. So this is a very clear indication that the water flow regime is changing and it's having a direct impact on the community. The impact of climate change and the brunt of climate change falls on women. Women are the people who are responsible for fetching the water for drinking purposes as well as for other domestic needs of each household in the community. They have to trudge long distances, mostly uphill, and they have to carry water in small utensils and navigate their way down precipitous slopes, which is not easy on their bodies. Women are also responsible for watering the fields. When there's scarcity of water, water is rationed. And if your turn happens to come during the night, then women have to stay up the whole night. And it's not as if they get to sleep during the morning and stay up at night. They have to do their duties during the daytime as well as the nighttime. So this takes a double toll on their bodies. It also affects the education of the girl child because usually it's the girl child that's plucked out of school to assist the mother or other female members in the household to fetch water. This has two impacts. It either means low enrollment of the girl child or it means poor attendance. This reduces the productivity of women and it reduces their capacity to be able to find employment later on because they haven't had the same education opportunity, and it, I think, sucks them deeper into the poverty trap. One of the other things that women often bemoan about is the inability to participate in cultural and social activities. And I think this side is not or less known to people. They often tell me that if there is a birth or a marriage in the village, they're not able to be part of the celebration because that means larger people or larger number of people coming to the village and they have to fetch water for them. If there's a death in the family, they do not have time for grieving and mourning because they have to, again, do their duty to fetch water for the people. And this is kind of sad, and as a woman, I think I can resonate with their emotional loneliness. So how do we help mountain communities to build their resilience and to adapt to climate change? We have to look at it from two different aspects at two different levels. One is local solutions. We need to empower communities. We need to mobilize them. We need to build their capacities. With the centrality of the role of women in the management and production and consumption of natural resources. Local infrastructure is extremely important. It's a very high priority with the mountain communities. It can be drinking water, it can be irrigation channels, it can be disaster risk reduction works, or it can be farm-to-market roads. But this is something that needs to be delivered to mountain communities on an urgent basis to build their economic resilience. Civil society and media can play a very important role in awareness and advocacy. But that does not mean that the private sector does not have a role to play. The private sector usually has the money, civil society has the knowledge, and government has the regulatory authority. So if the three come together, they can really become a dynamic force for change. Policies that are co-created with the people and in consultation with them are usually more successful. So policies have to be place-based, they have to be people-centered, and they have to have a gender perspective that is very strong and a role for women and the youth in decision-making. When we think about regional approaches, I think it would do us all good to remember that nature does not recognize man-made borders. Nature does not follow human rules, nor does it abide by lines that are drawn on the ground to divide countries. Ecosystems don't abruptly halt where one country ends and another one begins. So we have to look for ways in which we allow and maintain the free flow of goods and services through ecological corridors. The Himalayan mountains and the glaciers serve three major river basins: the Indus, the Ganga, and the Brahmaputra. If we take a basin approach, it's a win-win for everyone. We need to start looking at people as communities who live in a particular area with similar geographic characteristics, with similar ecosystems, with almost similar cultural habits and traditions, and facing the same challenges. So if you facilitate communication between people within and across borders, I think it'll help them to build their adaptive strength and to build resilience to face climate change together, because they will look at the environment as their home. But in order to do that, countries in South Asia need to start thinking along regional approaches and shift their focus from country-specific to a broader area. I think South Asian countries need to put their disputes and the differences aside and learn to work together to strengthen cooperation and work on concepts that promote ecological integrity. This is very important because South Asia is one region, and all the people who live in it, their lives are interconnected. So what happens in one place will automatically affect or have a fallout on the other place. And the sooner South Asian leadership recognizes this, the better it is for the well-being of the people as well as for the health of the environment. And lastly, in the concept of deep ecology, man and nature constantly interact and modify each other. We are living in the age of climate change, and I think it's very important, more so now than ever before, to understand that we need to create balance between human activity and nature so that both can thrive in tandem. Thank you.
Aisha Khan, that was a heartbreaking in some ways and also a big wake-up call for our countries as well. I mean, to give up on those man-made boundaries because environment and ecology does not recognize them. We have to work together. I think we have two countries with very similar characteristics that you spoke about, similar gender issues where the burden falls on women more in times of crisis of any sort. So yes, we are hoping that this will be the beginning of that big dialogue. You also spoke about migration, and I believe yesterday Sir Attenborough spoke to a hall packed with people overflowing, and he spoke about climate crisis and how it will lead to unprecedented migration. It's already happening in our countries, and I think it's time to stop it. Our next speaker will put it all together in terms of how the economy of South Asia countries are getting impacted. In my own country, there are 290 million people living below the poverty line. It's not a small number. It's perhaps equivalent to all of Europe's population. Let me invite on stage Mr. Muthukumar Mani. He's the lead economist of World Bank, for taking us through the economic impact of the melting Himalayan glaciers.
Thank you, Manisha. Good morning, everybody. So I'm going to talk about how the South Asian economies are going to be impacted by Himalayan glaciers. So let's start our story in this Kumik village, one of the highest and remotest villages in the world. It's connected to the rest of the world barely for 4 months through one single motorable road. Now, the people of Kumik were pretty much living for generations by practicing agriculture, which was being fed by streams from glaciers. But then what happened? A few years ago, the streams stopped. They had no water. So this community had no choice but to leave. In other words, they became one of the first victims of climate change. So there are hundreds and thousands of communities like Kumik living in this region who depend on water, food, energy, and livelihoods on these mountains. And they are melting, and they're melting fast because of climate change and black carbon. Let's start with water. South Asia is already a water-scarce region because of inefficiencies in use, inefficiency in policies, urbanization, population explosion, and so on and so forth, compounded by climate change. The groundwater depletion is already reaching alarming proportion in most of the countries of the region. Now, the meltwater from glaciers have been acting as a buffer against this onslaught of climate and other factors. But that hydrologic buffer that's been there is going away, which is going to put the region in far more crisis than what it is right now. One can think of that as a long-term problem, but there is also a clear and present danger. Now, when these glaciers melt, what happens is they form what's called glacial lakes on top of the mountains. There are hundreds of glacial lakes that have been formed over the last decade or so. Now, if these glacial lakes burst, which may happen because of increasing temperature or because of seismic activities, obviously it can cause havoc downstream in terms of loss of lives, loss of living livelihoods, loss of infrastructure, so on and so forth. So clearly, glacial lake outburst floods, GLOFs as they're called, they are a clear and present danger in the region, and that can cause huge economic losses. Food. The meltwaters from glaciers are important because they feed most of the important river basins in the region, like Ganges, Indus, and Brahmaputra. They are also important sources of irrigation water, both surface water and groundwater for most of the region. So what's going to happen as glaciers shed ice? There is a danger that these rivers may run out. Eventually run out, which in turn has huge implications for not only long-term sustainability of agriculture, but also in terms of sustainability of livelihoods for these poor farmers. Hydropower. These perennial rivers of South Asia have been an important source of hydropower for many decades. And the region especially has started looking into hydropower only recently as not only as a source of clean energy, but also as a way to fill their huge energy gap that they are facing for the millions of people living there. But as the rivers weaken because of glacier melt, what's going to happen to hydropower? The potential is in serious danger. And not only that, as we saw before, if disasters fueled by the glacial lake outbursts increase in frequency, that could cause huge damage to the hydro infrastructure that's already in place. The Himalayan mountains have always been a mecca for tourists and mountaineers and so on and so forth. And that leads to creation of a lot of jobs for porters, for Sherpas, for tea houses, for lodges, and so on and so forth. But once you start losing the ice in the pristine Himalayas, there's a danger that these tourism revenues may go down, and also that could have huge implications for the loss of jobs and livelihoods in the region. And similarly, if you see more increase in frequency of natural calamities, that could make trekking more hazardous, right, in this region, then that could also cause a huge loss of tourism revenues on which these economies are dependent on. So what do we do going forward? Of course, there's a saying which says you cannot manage what you cannot measure. So I think it's important for us to first understand how the glacial hydrological dynamics are working in the region. because the region is diverse, so a different topography, different climatic conditions. So I think first and foremost, it's really important to understand how climate change and black carbon are impacting glacier melt across the different sections, different river basins in the region. Then the findings of that should then inform our future policies and investment, whether you're planning a hydropower dam or an irrigation project. But what's happening right now is there's this research going on in different countries, but happening mostly in silos. So what is really important is the countries should get together, share data and knowledge about the glaciers, which cut across the region. And again, as Aisha mentioned, it calls for regional cooperation. This is a challenge that's faced by all the countries in the region that's going to eventually impact their people and their economies. So clearly they need to start working together, sharing data, sharing knowledge, sharing information, and also coming up with a common policy framework to deal with this common challenge. So we are actually working on a study right now called Glaciers of Himalayas that will address some of these important issues. So very soon you'll get to see the report, and hopefully that will inform the ongoing policy dialogue in the countries. In spite of all this doom and gloom, I would like to end on a positive note. This is the Ladakh region in India, and this community again is facing the same problem. They run out of water. This community doesn't have the water that they need during their peak summer months when they actually do their harvesting. So they came up with an innovative idea, creating these ice stupas or artificial glaciers, which in turn is serving them well during the summer months when they're not getting the stream water. Thank you.
Thank you, Mani, for putting together what could happen, what is happening right now, and why regional cooperation is very critical to mitigate the risks and probably turn the time around when it comes to melting Himalayan glaciers. I'm going to do a small panel discussion and then throw open this conversation to all our guests here. I'm sure all of you have a lot of questions. You're engaged with this topic. It is a critical one as well. And we have some esteemed guests in our audience as well who I would like them to be part of the panel discussion. So let me call here on the stage to join me Minister Mohammad Qayyumi. He's the Acting Minister of Finance of Afghanistan. So we'd love to hear your views, sir. He's written a book on public policy and land usage. And of course, lots of issues for you, sir, to grapple with right now. And we are now putting the Himalayan glaciers also for you to consider in your public policy. Please have your seat. And of course, Ms. Aisha Khan, can we have you back here with me? Mani, can we have you as well? We have Mr. Vikram Kirloskar. He's president of CII, that's Confederation of Indian Industry. He's the president and also the head of Toyota Kirloskar Motors in India. CII is a powerful business lobby, and Aisha spoke about how private sector needs to come together with policymakers, advocacy, media, and of course, civil society to bring about a change. So we're going to put all these four people on the hot seat. We will also be joined by Paul Majewski. He's joining us on the phone line from Nepal. So hopefully we will get some, are we getting him? Yes? All right, Paul, hi, Manisha here. Can you hear me? Can we try again? I'm going to try again because I would love to have him be part of the discussion. Paul Majewski, Manisha here. We are starting the questions and answers in the panel discussion. Can you hear me? All right, we'll try again. And if not, then we do have Aurora, who is also one of the specialists on climate change from National Geographic. She will join us. Come, Aurora. Can you be on that side? I think that would be better. We had Paul in the morning. We did all the sound checks, but it's Nepal, so I guess he doesn't have 4G on demand, and we haven't been able to get him. All right, thank you everybody for joining me. Minister Qayyumi, you're the man in the hot seat. I'm going to ask you a very tough question. For all our countries today, you know, we are still in the development phase. We have huge number of our population still under the poverty line. For us, there are human indicators which are extremely important. For your country, you're putting together the economic backbone of your country. In all of this, we are talking about climate change, and it is no less important a conversation. As a policymaker, what do you think your government can do to take cognizance of this impending crisis?
Well, thank you very much. Thanks for this opportunity. Definitely, first of all, I'd like to thank all of the speakers for their brilliant points that they raised. In Afghanistan, also, the tragedy of Afghanistan is one of the countries with that's producing the smallest carbon footprint, yet one of the countries that is very vulnerable to
I think
climate
a big
change.
round of applause for that, because we developing countries have not contributed that much to carbon emissions. And we are already on the way to reducing carbon footprint, isn't it, sir?
No, you're absolutely right. The second aspect of that is not only we're seeing the with this global climate change, we're seeing the cycles of drought and flood is increasing far faster than it used to. You know, like the cycles of drought and floods that we used to see every 10 to 15 years, or sometimes longer, it's becoming 2 to 3 years. You know, last year we had one of our worst droughts, but the same area were affected by floods as well. So it was a double whammy for the same area, that both were people were displaced, lost their livelihoods. To do is both in terms of the droughts and then the floods that followed. This year, for the first time, I think we've had quite a bit of snow and hopefully the crops will be good. But the problem was that we started having floods in February. That was quite a shock for many people. We had been doing a lot of planning and identifying vulnerable areas, but we did not expect to have that kind of situation in February, which we had a number of about four of our provinces on the west and in south got affected by the flood, and then. As we're doing more and more of the planning, what are the ways that we can look at the key issues? A few of the key pointers that we've found is, first of all, that whole idea of those large dams that was a big issue of both for irrigation and hydro. Do they really work? Do we have to look at different ways, even for the existing ones that we have, the regime of when agriculture should take precedence over hydro. These are some tough decisions that needs to, in environments where people have assumed water very much like oxygen. And along this line, one of the other factors that we see in a very strange way, the solar power industry has become such a detriment to this. And the part is that because as anybody can buy some solar panels and start depleting start putting pumps and deplete all of that water, we're seeing major problems, I think, in many of our countries for depleting the water table. So we see all of that as issues. So what we are trying to do is how we can recognize that what we thought as abnormal is the new normal, and in terms of these cycles for us, how we can really look at new models for water harvesting, whether it's small dams, whether it's a way that we can really use, and also then more importantly, now with the help of data that is available, that would really help us tremendously. And if I make one last comment,
please.
I hope this discussion also had talked about the interaction of the mountain people and let's say coastal people, because again, it's the mountains people's water that's keeping the coastal people thrive, because it's all of that mangrove and the life of the fish is dependent on that fresh water that's coming from the mountains. And for that one, let me raise a controversial question, and that will be to what extent the mountain people should have a claim on part of that fishing rights on the coastal area of all of these coastal countries.
Wow, that's a complicated question, but it's an important one to ask. I mean, in your country, the geographies are not that far apart, but in ours, it will take a long time for the mountain people to claim some sort of economic benefit from the water that they provide to the coastal regions and their economic benefits. We also, I've been told, have the Bhutan Finance Secretary, Mr. Nim Dorji, here with us. Thank you very much for being, and I'm sure that we will, if you can come here, sir, so, we can have a dialogue with you as well a little bit later, because Bhutan is a big participant and, of course, a stakeholder in the Himalayan regions. And, of course, we also have a Nepal delegation here. And it would be great if, yes, sir, please, can you be here? So, we can have a two-way dialogue. And right now, Paul Majewski is in Nepal. All right. So now we pretty much have the region covered, isn't it? So we will hopefully have some good solutions coming out. That's an important question. I think my next question will be to Mr. Kirloskar here. Mr. Kirloskar, private sector. Now, 2018, we hit an all-time high on carbon emissions. That just about every country had a higher carbon emission and a footprint. And we need to now start reversing it. Businesses and private companies have a very important role to play in it. CII is an important lobby in India. Are you looking at the direction? Are you actually putting some pressure on your members to have a clear plan on cutting down their carbon footprint?
Yes, we have. And let me talk for the general industry first and a little bit what my company is also doing. But before that, I've been trekking in the Himalayas. I've been to close to where Paul was. And I've been in Sikkim as well, in Zongri near Kanchenjunga. And it's a highly spiritual trek. When you go up there, the beauty is unbelievable, and the guides tell you how much the glaciers have retreated. And it's just amazing. And it's sad to see that kind of a water thing going back. Regarding industry, from CII, we have been working on the issue of carbon and water and green buildings for some time. We have 3 centers of excellence devoted to this. One is the Green Building Centers. It was the first sort of center, and the first building we built as our office building in the Green Building Center was the Leeds Platinum building. And from the work we've done in this center, either showing people how to build green buildings or auditing them, I think we have the largest number of platinum-rated buildings outside of the United States. And this is something which is going on. Again, it's causing people to compete now. Anyone wants to build an office building, he wants to compete and make it's important public announcement to make a green building. I think definitely our members in CII are working in it, and so many other industries as well. Second is the Water Institute we started about 4 or 5 years ago. And the Water Institute, it's based in Delhi. We're grading companies as blue companies and districts as blue districts. We've developed a kind of a tool called WaterScan using satellite data. And what that is doing is taking a district, we're applying this in districts, looking at the water flows, and trying to make a water scarce district into a water surplus district. And this has started working. The Water Institute also works on lakes, cleaning up lakes, natural storage of water, and various other projects. The third is the Center of Sustainable Development, which is basically focusing on carbon. My theme for CII this year, and I've agreed with the next 2 presidents that we'll continue for 3 years. 2 of my themes are on energy security and on environment sustainability. And we will talk about this throughout the next 3 years and talk with members on this. Last 2 years, when I was visiting many small towns and having membership meetings, we talked about this environment. I talked about what my company does on the environment. And let me tell you, everyone wants to do it. I don't think industry wants to be back on a back step. They want to contribute towards reduction in carbon. It requires a behavioral change, I think a mindset change, that carbon is going to be dangerous for us in the future. What we've done in our company, Toyota Kirloskar Motors, over the last 4 or 5 years, we first explained people on what is the effect of carbon change. And then we've done a lot of work, not only just the high technology level, but also at each small innovation level, to a point where we are using 0 fresh water in a car factory, 100% recycle and 100% rainwater harvesting. And my specific water consumption 2011-12, that's water per car requirement, we've reduced from 3.73 meters to 0.73 meter cube. It's a substantial reduction.
So that's a big step.
Same thing on carbon CO2 emissions.
All right.
So I think this will happen across the country. We are going to push it across the country.
So I'm glad to hear that at least the business community in India, CII, is going to push all the members to reduce their carbon footprint and carbon emissions, and probably have set goals on how much reduction has to take place every year. I believe Paul Majewski is with us now. Paul, hi. Can you hear us? All right. Seems like either the phone line doesn't like my voice. So the question is to Aurora. Aurora, so there is this whole community out there which poo-poos the idea of climate change, and they say, it's really not happening, and we are overblowing it, and there are some important people who actually deny climate change. As we hear, or we heard Paul, he said there is absolute proof of the fact that it is happening. It is also destroying the Himalayan glaciers. Ice melt is real, and it is happening today. It's only going to accelerate and create probably a much larger, problems in the future. Can you run us through what are some of the biggest contributors for the melting glaciers in that region?
Yeah, thank you, Manisha. Sorry, everyone, to be such a letdown from Paul. I'm just here.
We are glad you're here.
No, my name's Aurora Elmore. I'm a climate change expert and senior program manager at National Geographic, and I work very closely with Paul on this project. So I think that's a really great question, Manisha. There are a lot of people who doubt climate change exists, and one of the important things I like to say is that those people are not scientists. And there's some very important scientific papers that have come out recently that say 98% of the entire scientific community who understands climate change and research climate change every day fully support the premise of anthropogenic or human-caused climate change affecting the way we all live today. So that's one.
You can't deny it. There's enough scientific evidence to say it's here.
Yeah, it would be really helpful if we could all get on the same page, climate change is happening, and start that productive conversation of what are we going to do about it. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a great question. The second piece of your question is what's happening to the glaciers, and I think there's a variety of changes affecting these high glaciers. One is temperature, which is increasing around the globe. It's increasing especially rapidly on the third pole. Of course, we all know from our drinking glasses that warmer water melts ice. The other change is a change to the color of the ice. As you add black carbon, as you add dust, other particulates, particularly particulate organic carbon, or POPs, they change the color of the ice. Darker colors attract solar energy rather than reflect solar energy, and therefore lead to increasing rates of melting of the ice. And the third is a change in precipitation. When snow falls on a glacier, it's like wearing a cozy winter jacket, and it helps keep the glacier cold. When rain falls on the glacier, it actively destroys the surface of the glacier and helps to melt it even faster. So the change in precipitation from snow to rain can actually really be detrimental to the glaciers.
So the number that was flashed, which was 2/3 of the glaciers or Himalayan glaciers will be lost to ice melt by 2100, is that, that is a reality staring at us, isn't it? It is not just a figure and number on a paper.
Yeah, that's a very real number. It comes from a report from ICIMOD in Nepal. That's an intergovernmental panel of all of the Himalayan countries contribute. Mm-hmm. And that stands from the number of glaciers that are due to be lost if we continue to warm at the rate that we're warming, which is what scientists anticipate will happen since there has been no major curb of CO2 production.
No major curve of CO2 production. 2018, I'm coming back to the figure, we hit an all-time high on carbon emissions, and almost every country actually had increased carbon emissions. Aisha Khan, you also lead the Coalition of Civil Society for Climate Change in Pakistan. This is, we've spoken about behavioral change. So it's, the most vulnerable are the mountain communities, the most vulnerable are the poorest, but essentially the carbon footprint and maximum of it is created either by the richer nations or by the richer people in our own countries. How do you bring about a behavioral change? Have you looked into it? And is civil society in Pakistan talking about it?
At the civil society level, we engage with the government, we engage with the academia, with the media, and with the private sector as well. And we operate at two different levels. One is at the local level, where we try to impress upon the government that the policies they make should be place-based and people-centered, and they should be climate-smart. So we co-create policy, and this is directly in line with the Lima Paris Action Agenda that gives civil society a very clear role in shaping and formulating policy, and also based on the principles of the Open Government Partnership. And Pakistan became a member of the Open Government Partnership in 2016, so that legitimizes the role of civil society. And at the international level, there is not much that you can do, but when the Conference of Parties takes place, civil society organizations are present there in large numbers. And that is the forum where you impress your point of view to tell developed countries that climate change is happening because of the carbon emissions that you have emitted. And it is now having a disproportionately high impact on our communities or the developing countries. And we don't have the financial resources, we don't have the human resource, we don't have technology, and we don't have the coping mechanisms. So we need financial assistance through the Adaptation Support Fund to build the adaptive strength of our communities so they can cope better and mitigate the impacts that will befall them.
Mm-hmm. Mani, you have Nepal, Bhutan, India, Afghanistan, Pakistan all around you. What is it that you want to say to us? Regional cooperation, yes, it's easier said than done, though.
Again, as I mentioned, this is a challenge that cuts across all the countries, and it's going to impact their economies, both upstream and downstream. And right now what's happening is there is research happening on the topic, but it's very sporadic and it's in silos. I think what's really important for the countries at least to start working together at the research level, to start sharing data, sharing information, sharing knowledge. So at least that could be a starting point before we get into the high level, policy dialogue and so on and so forth. And also as these countries plan their development plans, especially for Nepal in terms of hydro or Bhutan in terms of hydro, I think they need to factor in these issues because you cannot just ignore that 30 years from now, 40 years from now, the water resources scenario is going to be very different from what it is today. So I think once we have the knowledge, I think that knowledge then should inform our investment plans, our policies on development, projects, so that going forward.
So we will wait for that World Bank report. I'm going to bring in the gentleman from Nepal. And of course, you heard all our panelists here, sir. Can I get a short introduction of you? I'm sorry, but
thank you so much.
That would be great to have.
My name is Harish Chandra Dakal, and I'm from the Ministry of Finance.
Oh, fantastic.
So now I'm one of the member of the delegation in the spring meeting also this time, and my delegation head is in the another meeting in the IDA forum. So I'm here, and thank you so much for this opportunity to speak from the Nepal side.
You're blessed. You've got the best of the Himalayas in your country.
Yeah.
So
I think
you probably have the responsibility of protecting them the most as well.
Yeah, it is not only our responsibility; it is all of us. And I think, in last week, we got unexpected hurricane, tornado in our southern part of Nepal, and it killed at least 27 people and more than 600 people displaced because of that hurricane. It was really unexpected. It is the first time in our history that we know. So such kind of events are occurring, and as you mentioned that hydropower also, we have to think about whether we really can sustain. We invest in the hydropower, and then whether the water will still continue to come from the Himalayas is a great concern.
So the government is cognizant of the fact that climate change is happening. You're seeing unusual events, which is actually
yes. So this kind of we are thinking about this also, and while developing our hydropower also. So it's going on.
All right, so that World Bank report will be very helpful, I think, for bringing everybody together. Mr. Kim Dorji, have I got your name right? So Nim Dorji, sorry. Mr. Dorji, Bhutan, again, is it an important conversation for policymakers, the government of your country?
Thank you. I think melting Himalayan glaciers and Bhutan being one of the countries located on the foothills of Himalayas, this topic is very, very close to our heart. Bhutan is a mountainous country located in a very fragile ecosystem of these young Himalayas, and that itself brings and talks so much about Bhutan. Bhutan is committed to be carbon neutral, and presently Bhutan is the only country that's carbon negative.
Wow. That's, I think, deserves a really big round of applause. You have a beautiful, beautiful country, sir.
Yes.
And you should protect it and preserve it.
And what we have adopted is we have adopted development philosophy of gross national happiness instead of gross domestic product. And one of the pillars of this gross national happiness is environment conservation. So in order to maintain this very fragile ecosystem intact, untouched, we have devoted our resources and time to protect the environment. So environment protection and conservation continues to be one of the major pillars of our development policy. In the being a landlocked country and located in this very, fragile ecosystem, what we have to do, traditionally Bhutanese people have developed a very symbiotic relationship with the environment. You respect the mountains, you respect trees, you respect rivers. So therefore, all these beautiful snow-clad mountains that you see and the beautiful lakes covered with glaciers are considered as abode of God and goddesses, or fortress of God and goddesses, where you make wishes and your wishes are fulfilled. And rightly, I think all the river systems originate from these beautiful mountains, and it helps to grow all these crops in the fertile land. So therefore, all this helps. Now, what are we doing? The challenges of this climate change. As I said, Bhutan is a carbon neutral, but we are also impacted with climate change. For the first time, we have experienced erratic nature in weather and also in climate. Last year, we have missed snowfall, and as a result, the river volumes decrease, and Bhutan is highly dependent on hydropower. So the hydropower generation has decreased by 15%. That did impact our revenue generation. And this 2018 winter, December, Bhutan has experienced high level of icing. Even in the capital Thimphu, the water supply system was basically disrupted with high level of icing. And that itself was a very, very, I think, new experience for us. Our water supply distribution system was not prepared to respond to such high level of icing. And again, this winter we have experienced high level of snowfalls. Very different.
These are events which are happening, and they're a clear example of the fact that climate change is happening.
And what we are doing is, these are some of the challenges we are facing. So what are we doing? We are investing in climate resilient infrastructure. We are investing in climate resilient crops, livestock, and then other related development activities, so that our people are prepared for that. But what we have to realize is that Bhutan is a carbon neutral country. So with the help of the bank, what we have done is we have prepared an assessment to see if we monetize the carbon neutral, the tons of carbon credit that we have, how much is it worth? Is it really worth maintaining carbon neutral?
Right.
So this is one of the challenges, and we are working with the bank very closely to see how we can benefit from this. Thank you very much for giving this opportunity.
Thank you very much for sharing that. I mean, just the fact that your hydro energy is down 15%, Thimphu faced snow and ice like you'd never expected is just all an example of the fact that it's completely changing. The entire topography of the Himalayan glaciers is changing, ice is melting, and we don't want to be looking back 20 years from now and saying, we could have done so much more. I think this is just a big wake-up call. Conversations and dialogues like these give us some points to take back home, engage with decision makers and civil society, media, and of course I'm part of media. We will be telecasting this show on CNBC, which all the business houses will also be listening into. So hopefully the change will carry on and we will do something about it sooner than later. All my panelists, thank you very much for joining me today. We've completely run out of time. Do we have time for the question answers from the people? I am so happy to hear that, yes. Anybody, if anybody has a question, I would be very happy to bring the mic to you. You have the mics, you can, all right, can you go on the stand and, oh, you're heading out, all right, okay. I thought you had a question and I was so excited, somebody really young has a question. It's your future. All right, please, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Jean Mayer. I'm an ancient Peace Corps volunteer in Nepal many years ago. My headmaster told me about the landing on the moon by the United States at the time that I was there. I was more entranced with what was going on in my village. But recently I've come here and I'm studying international economics because I think that's a big part of all the issues, and also have taken an interest in water in Nepal, first water pollution, then I discovered all the dam building that's going on and many of the issues that you've talked about, but you've also expanded my understanding a great deal, which has been very pleasant to be here and hear all this. I am wondering, many of the big dams are being built by China, and there is involvement of China in what's going on in Nepal and around the area. And I'm wondering, it would be good to hear a voice from China, or if you have any understanding about, China's involvement in this in a regional context. Thank you.
Okay. Anybody from China here? If not, I think I'll leave it to Mani to take that question. I mean, big dams getting built, you're talking about hydropower. I put him in the hot seat, haven't I? You can decline. But yes, it's a big concern. I mean, there is this infrastructure which countries are asking for. I don't think it's specific to China, but it's just development needs, but you also have sustainability to keep in mind. And I think every country has to just balance that, isn't it?
Sure, it's all about building a climate resilient infrastructure, irrespective of who is building it, whether it's a bank or China. I think it's, in this day and age, you cannot obviously build an infrastructure without taking into account the impact of climate change and its implications for water resources and so on.
You had something to add? Yes, we could pass on one of the mics to you.
In Nepal, I think there are two kind of hydropower projects, like runoff river and the reservoir. On reservoir, definitely we have to build high dams, but these dams are always taken care of environmental impact assessment. So I don't think this is the really great concern in Nepal. I think
it's not a big concern.
It's not a
right. I'm sure that some amount of comforts come from your.
Yeah.
All right, there's a question at the back. Yes, go ahead.
Yes, hello, thank you. My name is...
It'd be nice to get your introduction.
Yes. My name is Daniel Klassander. I'm from the Swedish development agency, SIDA. Thank you for a very interesting seminar, and I think it's great to see the World Bank really focusing on this very crucial and urgent issue of the climate change in Himalayas. I was wondering a little bit about, because you have mentioned very important topics like the need for more regional cooperation and more research and sharing of knowledge and data. At the same time, then I wonder if the World Bank or the partners here involved have worked more with ICIMOD, the regional organization based in Nepal, which is a membership organization of the 8 countries that are sharing the Himalayas. They are actually working on a lot of these things that has been mentioned here today, but I haven't really heard them being mentioned. So I was curious about any kind of partnership there. Otherwise, I would encourage you to really work with them going forward. Thank you.
I know National Geographic works with them very closely. Maybe it's time for the World Bank as well to do
we also work
you
very
also
closely
work
with ICIMOD, yeah. Anything to do with Himalayas, ICIMOD is our...
That's what he was talking about. Okay.
Very much.
And in fact, that data that Manisha mentioned earlier comes directly from the ICIMOD report, which Steve also mentioned a few times during his presentation. We're working really closely with them on a lot of projects in Nepal right now. We'll start talking about those pretty soon.
You have a mic, sir?
Yeah.
Mr. Kayomi.
It was not specifically about this, but I think in recognizing that these are systemic issues that crosses borders, but also all of our human activity, whether it's the use of energy, whether it's the use of water, whether it's all of the infrastructure that we build, whether it's the kind of manufacturing that we have, with the level of pollution that we produce. All of these ones are so much interconnected. So practically, I think every aspect of our human activity needs to be analyzed and looked at in terms of an environmental impact. And I think that's how we can really build solutions that will be optimal. Because right now, every group is working on their own silo without recognizing what's happening. I just want to mention one simple thing, and this is we began working in terms of what India had done in terms of leveling the agricultural land. If we level in Afghanistan, many of it is not level. So what happens is that one area of an agricultural land gets too much water, one area does not get enough. And as part of it, by leveling, we can reduce water consumption by 30%. We can increase the yield by over 25%. And these are just one example. There are similar examples when we talk about manufacturing, whether it's reducing energy losses, what we use for transportation. All of these factors needs to be looked at as environmental aspect, as one aspect of everything that we do in our human activity, I think.
I think you've really hit the nail on its head. Every aspect of human activity. And the saddest part is that this is a carbon neutral or a negative country, but they can't escape the other country's bad behaviors. And we all have to work towards even protecting Bhutan in our own countries. Yes, sir. You have a question.
Yes. My name is Stephen Schoenberger, and I'm in the water global practice at the World Bank. I really wanted to appreciate Aisha's presentation. I recently had the opportunity to go to Nepal and to travel to some of the communities where we're supporting through our projects on water supply for mountain communities. And I was very much struck by what you emphasized, that while they obviously tremendously appreciated the water, there's a part of the project that we hadn't valued enough, which was it supports women's self-help groups. And as you said, that connection is so intimate in those communities that as soon as the water supply comes online, they're able to expand their own economic activities and social activities enormously. So it really is just a validation of exactly what you were pointing out. And it was something that was emphasized. The Minister of Water Supply in Nepal, the intimacy she has with the mountains. She's one of the first Nepalese women to climb Everest. And she actually invited me to join her on the next expedition. I don't think I'm going to do that. But, she seemed much more fit than I am. But the other quick point I wanted to make, and it was really very much in response to His Excellency the Minister from Afghanistan, which is as these new challenges come up in terms of the melting of the glaciers, which is not something we can stop unilaterally within the context of the Himalayas. That's a global issue. But these realities are coming, and the resiliency that has to be developed. And you made a very important point that we can't fall back on the old structural solutions as the only way. And I really appreciated your saying that, because what we're really looking at and trying to bring into the discussion with the various partners in the countries is the idea of how we adapt work with the ecology and adapt our social systems to do what the Dutch have famously called living with floods a little more. And obviously there's a lot of resiliency and aspects we can learn from the communities already. But I think it's very important that we don't automatically go for the large structural issues. That'll be part of it, but that we really look to see how we bring together the structural, the green infrastructure, the ecological service aspects, as well as the social adaptation. I'd be very interested to hear from some of the representatives from the countries how they see that happening in their own countries. Thank you.
All right. Aisha?
When I look at the Himalayan mountain glaciers, I see a security problem there as well, which I want to highlight over here, because there is the upper riparians and the lower riparians. And because the relationship between most of these South Asian countries is dysfunctional at the best of times, we need to work towards cooperation and integration over here. So it's very important when we talk about building dams, the earlier question as well, the same suspicion comes to mind. What if your water sources are stopped, and what if the lower riparian is not going to have enough water? So transboundary flows have to be factored into the conversation. And that is why, if we start looking at humanity first and countries later, we'll be able to find better solutions. We have to put, people at the center of this conversation. And we have to recognize that it's going to affect all of us. And the solutions that we find must be acceptable to everyone. And I always always emphasize on the centrality of the role of women in this conversation, because often they're left out of the climate conversations. And they are the ones who actually manage mountain resources or natural resources everywhere. And the other security aspect that comes to my mind is climate-induced migrations. We're seeing more and more that as a trend that is taking place. The population in South Asia is burgeoning and the resource base is shrinking. And what we see is, vested interest groups pitted for resources and they grab for themselves. So this is creating demographic shifts, and it has its own set of problems, and it is contributing to societal strife and conflict in the area. So we need to keep all these different aspects in mind, and like the minister said, the environment, the moment we touch the environment, we need to see how it's going to affect our lives, because it's connected to each one of us. And as climate change begins to happen, I think more and more it's going to exacerbate the impacts of how it will affect us. So we all need to change our behavior. We all need to take it at a more personal level and start thinking of how can we reduce our own personal carbon footprint. And governments talk about it, yes, but not enough is being done. Manisha herself says that 2018 is poised to be, was the hottest year, and 2019 is poised to be yet even hotter. And the IPCC report that has come out is rather alarming, because it closes the window for action. It's giving us just 12 years to respond.
And keep it to 1.5 degrees,
keep
not
it to
even
1.5. So the Paris Agreement talked about 2, but it was ambitious to say that it should be reduced to 1.5 degrees. But we don't see that happening everywhere. If you see the part per million carbon, it's still 4.3, and it needs to come down to 3. So we all need to do more.
Quick comment.
I think almost all the finance ministers of the world are here. Why don't you push carbon taxation? No one wants to talk about it.
Absolutely.
High carbon, high tax.
Yeah.
That it'll push technology. It'll push this, and it'll push technology. You can keep pushing the barrier up every 4 or 5 years. Push the goal post higher every couple of years.
Carbon tax. It's time's come. These are unpopular decisions. No politician wants to take it. But if you don't do it, I don't think we will reach anything.
You saw what happened in France with the yellow vests, So for any democratic government, it's not going to be easy to push through these measures.
Well, we'll have to. Like I said, 20 years from now, we don't want to be looking back and saying we could have done so much more, because climate change is affecting everybody. We can feel the heat, we can feel the extreme cold, we can see topography is changing around us, and nothing, we can't just wish it away. We can't bury our heads in the sand like ostriches and say, is this going to go away? It's not going to go away. Well, on that note, I'm going to conclude. I think we've finished with all the ideas, and well, I can't say all the ideas, the beginning of the conversation and some ideas, and I'm hoping that World Bank will continue to spearhead this regional cooperation, which is very necessary. That report will be an eye-opener. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being part of this discussion. Pleasure to have you with me here. And of course, I would like to call upon Hart Schaefer for his concluding remarks.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Manisha, and thank you very much to all the panelists and everybody who has contributed to this session. It's going to be very difficult to summarize it up, but I want you to think about what we just went through over the last hour and a half, this journey. Next time we fly across the Himalayas and we have a window seat, certainly I will look at the glaciers through a different lens, and I hope that, and I'm sure that you will too. It is not about numbers. It's not about 1 degree, 1.5 degrees. It's about people, women, vulnerable, the villagers, the elderly. It is also about partnerships, and this is what I see here. Partnerships between the private sector, between National Geographic, between civil society, between governments and international organizations. And a message for the countries and ministers and secretaries, thanks for joining us. It is also about regional integration. One country alone is not able to resolve this. It is a regional solution for a regional problem, for a global problem. Thank you very much.